welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged podcast. Now, I first met today's guest when I was visiting Perth in Western Australia. I can't remember how many years ago, quite a few years ago. I was actually there promoting the latest series of Red Dwarf, the comedy series set in deep space. And so it was great. It was a real contrast to meet Ray. I think we had lunch together that time, and I've met him a couple of times since. And it was a joy that he lives in Perth, which is a long, long way from Brisbane. But he was visiting his brother in Brisbane, which is fantastic. So we managed to get together and spend a morning together, catching up. And what he's done in the last few years is amazing. I follow him on Twitter. He is an absolute goldmine of amazing information about the energy transition, about the way we not only technically deal with it, but politically as well. So he's been very involved in Australian politics for many years. He was an advisor to the Western Australian government. He is a professor of, and I'm just going to check I get this right, with the School of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Western Australia, and has been for many years. But he does so many other things. He's a kind of futurist. He's an advisor and a consultant, and he's worked with all kinds of people all over the world. He's an extraordinary man, very well connected and very, very well informed, and an absolute fascinating and charming guest to have on the Fully Charged podcast. Well, what's happening in this country, as you will hear in this conversation I had with Ray, is in a way the transition that is now taking place was held back for many years by the previous administration, very peculiarly. They were very devoted to coal, basically. And what's happened since the election last year is like all the changes that have taken place around the rest of the world are all happening at once in Australia. It is extraordinary. It's like a genuine kind of tidal wave of change that is pushing through the whole country. Really remarkable, real joy to witness this and be here at this a really special time. This year is a real pivotal year. It has to be, because we haven't got very long to sort this stuff out, as Ray will explain. But please welcome to the Fully Charged podcast, Professor Ray Wills. Ray, thank you so much for not only finding time, but finding a lovely location to record this. It's very nice to be here.
It's great to catch up again.
Yeah, no, it's good. So can you do just a brief rundown of how you got to where you are and how your interest was sparked, and whether you changed opinions in the last sort of 20 years as technology changed?
Yeah, I mean, look, I started life as a child is the usual line you've got to start.
That's so unique.
Yeah, but ultimately, last century I was a botanist and an ecologist for government. I was doing broad-scale ecological survey. I was using all these new fandangled things that had just been invented.
Right.
Because I'm that old.
Yeah.
Landsat imagery. In the 80s, I was using Landsat for my PhD, and Landsat had been launched in 1979, so rather timely. I was at that point writing my C programs on punch cards.
Wow.
And so I transitioned into using the bigger computers that were coming, but also then onto my Mac that had just been released. I got mine in 1985.
Right.
And that became the workhorse for processing all of my data, looking at geospatial imagery, looking at hyperspectral image analysis with the Landsat imaging.
Right.
And that started to create a thing that we didn't call it back then, is big data.
Right.
It wasn't actually terribly big by comparison to what we call big data today, but it was the first of. And so starting to explore relational databases and getting all that tied together. My PhD was on honeybees, and I was looking at energy efficient foraging by honeybees. So energy was in there. I'll call it efficient foraging by honeybees, but it was about energy. It was about nectar sources. It was about sunshine being converted into energy.
Yeah.
And so looking at the way that system worked. When I did that, I was getting into collecting big data sets, starting to write research papers. Research papers started to trot into management plans.
Right.
Management plans started to trot into writing implementation for management plans, and we're moving on years at a time here. And then eventually starting to write business plans for implementation of management plans, and I got to the point senior enough where actually I was starting to write the policy about the business plans and about the management plans, and what do we do in response to certain things I was working on plant diseases
Right.
in ecosystems, a thing called dieback in Western Australia, and I did the first ecological work on that particular topic. But I was also studying fire in ecosystems, looking at salinity, looking at a whole range of different disturbances that come along.
Right.
But essentially, I was just a geek playing with toys.
Yeah.
And so I got to the end of the century, and I had an opportunity to go and work in the West Australian Parliament.
Right.
Because of my policy roles.
Yeah.
And so that was an employee. I was working on a parliamentary committee system.
Wow.
And I was a principal research officer for parliamentary committees.
Right.
And I discovered that they were very interested in me, and they employed me, and then they appointed me to the Joint Standing Committee on the Anti-Corruption Commission.
Right. Wow.
And I went, oh, okay.
Because it's not really your specialist area.
It was a great lesson, because as a
Yeah.
scientist, as a researcher, collecting data, analysing
Yeah.
and putting it out, that's what it all became about. But, at that point, I used to quip that, I used to think that a plant was green and had leaves on it, but apparently a plant's something you do to a copper to get even with him.
Yes.
So this all evolved.
Wow.
And I spent a few years working there. And one of the last inquiries that I was involved in, amongst quite a number, was because it was a license for education. Every 6 months you had a new inquiry,
Yes.
completely different topic: management of the strata title industry, closure of the Windermurra mine, apprenticeships and traineeships, sustainability of the dairy industry, which was a bit closer to home.
Yeah.
But then this last one was on renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Right.
And so that was really my first introduction to energy that we're all more familiar with.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was starting to get to the point where a plant was something you put diesel into to get energy out of. So,
Yeah.
the plant story keeps evolving here.
Yeah.
And so I then went off to work for the West Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which is one of the biggest chambers in Australia. And I was involved in writing resources and energy policy, and policy on extractive industries, policy on water extraction, policy on transport, a whole range of different things there. So again, I was just being educated.
Yeah.
It was great. It was preparing me for what my next role might be.
Right.
And I'll draw a breath in a minute.
No, it's
Back to
good.
you.
It's fantastic.
I've got an image of Robin Williams talking to Parkinson and just not stop talking. But we got to that point, worked for the chamber, left the chamber, became a consultant, but that wasn't really for me. And then I was invited to take over a role with the Sustainable Energy Association of Australia, as it
Right.
was back then, the WA Sustainable Energy Association. And so the task there was to bring people together on this new thing called renewable energy
Yeah.
that was really starting to take off in 2006 and 2007, around about the same time that Al Gore appeared to talk about
Yes.
that. I wrote Al Gore's press release for him in Western Australia.
Wow. When he came to talk there.
When he did the Inconvenient Truth
Right.
release around Australia. So the picture studio had a headquarter in Western Australia, and that group contacted me and said, "We've got Al come to town, can you do something to help?"
Right.
And I said, "Yeah, well, here you go," and fed him a whole pile of stuff.
Right.
Well, now I reflect on that, was for free. Anyway, but at the time it was absolutely a privilege to be a part of that whole movement, to talk about it. And around about that same time, the reason I started to get into renewable energy data was, and heading up the Sustainable Energy Association, was there wasn't a lot of data.
Right.
We didn't have information about how many wind turbines were out there. It was drip fed.
Right.
It took a couple of years. The International Energy Agency, when they collect data, and particularly more so back then, they take 2 or 3 years to
Right.
accumulate a data set. And when they reported on the 2006 energy market for the globe,
Right.
there was always an asterisk next to it. And the asterisk said from 2004.
Right.
2005 and 2006 was estimated,
Right. Wow.
and estimated by folks who we've witnessed over time haven't been terribly good at perceiving the change.
Right.
And so,
So you'd say they were underestimating rather than overestimating.
yeah,
Right.
and so
Wow.
what they were just expecting fossil fuels to continue on
Yeah,
as
yeah.
normal. So their data sets, the last couple of years of data were not data, they were estimates.
Right.
And their estimates were, this is what we expect.
Yeah.
So they didn't expect the change.
Yeah.
And a whole pile of people have commented on that particular lacking in the the agencies, the international agencies are responsible for it, but also, in the large forecasting houses.
Right.
Bloomberg had responded by creating this new entity called Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
New Energy Finance, yes.
And they too were on that exact same path at about that time.
Right.
They were a bit bigger than me, so they were a bit more accessible
Yeah.
to data. But we all started to assemble data sets that reflected what we could find out from the market.
Right.
And the difference was, and Bloomberg were exceptional in this, they were going to manufacturers
Right.
to say, what are you making?
Yeah.
Rather than, as the IEA were doing, saying, hey guys, can you tell us what you did last year?
Yes. Yes.
And not the manufacturers, but just, talking to governments. And IEA harvested data from governments,
Right.
and still do. And so they wrote a letter to the government. The government wrote a letter back, yes, saying, yeah, we'll send it shortly. Oh, how soon shortly? Oh, yeah, soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so eventually, 2 years on, they got up to date with the data from 3 years ago.
Right. Wow.
So again, what Bloomberg and the sort of stuff that I was doing at Future Smart Strategies, and in this point at the Sustainable Energy Association, was to try and understand the picture.
Yeah.
So while Bloomberg were doing a lot more globally, I really just followed on their footsteps, but I did a lot more regionally.
Right.
And I really looked at Australia, the Asia Pacific, thinking about how those sorts of numbers would come to bear. And that really brought me to this data gathering role. And so since then, I've moved from being the head of a industry association to running an advisory firm, talking about what the future might look like.
Right.
And nowadays, I don't only have data sets of solar panels, but TV sets and smartphones and motor cars.
Right.
And seeing how all that fits together. Where does the energy flow?
Yeah.
So it's really no different to honeybee harvesting of nectar. I'm still looking at the energy flows.
Yes, it is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That connection. But I mean, I think, because I'd love you to put it into context, because the scale, for sort of Northern Europeans, even North Americans, the scale of space that you have in Australia and population size. I mean, Western Australia is really at the kind of extreme end of that. Isn't it true when you're in Perth, you're nearer Singapore than you are Sydney, or one of it's
nearer Singapore than Brisbane, certainly.
Than Brisbane, yeah.
Which is, Sydney's just squeezes in there. So Sydney's close.
But I mean, it's a very not a huge city, but it's in a very enormous state. I mean, I don't know how big Western Australia is. It's big.
Yeah. Look, I should know the numbers. I used to know the numbers, but they're not going to sit in my brain right now. So, but it's big. Space is big, really big, and so is Western Australia. To quote Douglas Adams. Look, I think the reality is in Western Australia, I've always said, because we've got essentially three separate areas of energy use. You've got the southwest. Right. WA, the Southwest Interconnected System, that's the stuff that's all on the poles and wires, and we're not connected across the Nullarbor to the East Coast, which is the national.
So there's no grid connection
there's
between.
No grid connection across the Nullarbor, and there's 1,000 kilometres. So you
quite
really ask the question, why would you?
Yeah.
The answer to why would you is, well, you'd electrify your rail network.
Yeah.
You'd have charging stations along there for your trucks. You'd maybe take some trucks off and put them on the rail network.
Yeah.
That's a bit more controversial. We might circle back to that. But you could electrify your rail network using electricity along the way, make sure that it's accessible to your highway network so that all of the traffic that's going across the Nullarbor, and there's a fair amount,
right.
Not a fair amount. It's not commercially logical to do it.
It can't be, no.
But it's nation building.
Yes.
Why would you build a Snowy Hydro? Why would you build an Ord? Why would you build this electric railway?
Yeah.
Because it's nation building.
Yeah.
And it teaches us a lot about what we can do. Which brings me back to talk about WA. And so we've got a second grid called the Northwest Interconnected System, because they're really imaginative with their the way they name these things.
So that's the Northwest. Okay,
so there's the Swiss and the Nuis. we're on a roll here. And that's really the Pilbara, where all the oil and where all the gas is coming from, where all the iron ore is being exported through. That little part there is connected. It's in its energy use is almost as big as all of the southwest.
You're kidding? No. It's got a much smaller population, surely.
Population. But it's all about industry.
It's about the industry.
So it's about compressing gas, and that gets measured, and it's about crushing iron ore and sending it off and so forth. So, but actually, most of the mines for the iron ore are off-grid. They're not on the Nuis, they're not on the Swiss, and there's 100,000 people that also live in those places
Wow.
that are off the grid. You've got your mini grids like Broome, which is a system of about 20 megs
Right.
in it, and about 10 to 12,000 people, up to 13 to 15,000 people during the holidays. So they've got to be able to cater with that sort of change, as opposed to other places which simply aren't tourist destinations, and much smaller, like say Derby or Carnarvon. Carnarvon, like to think they're a tourist destination. It's a pretty place.
Yeah.
Recommend everybody go there. But it's just the difference in scale that you have. Horizon Power manages that remote network of towns. There's 39 microgrids in that space for the 39 towns that are there. Anybody that's smaller than that is essentially on their own microgrid. They're self-managing, they're personally managing, and that includes in some cases some of the Aboriginal corporation, the Aboriginal towns that are running themselves, and they're doing their own thing as well, often with support from Horizon Power, but more and more Aboriginal corporations are becoming extraordinarily capable. A lot of lifting of skill sets, a lot of lifting of management of country, and that's a really good news story as well. And that was something that wasn't true 15 years ago, but has become increasingly true, to the point where I think this decade the function of Aboriginal corporations is going to be a different thing. I'm starting to digress down a rabbit hole there, but I'll come back. But wrapping all that together, Western Australia is really interesting, because if you can, as a big company, come to Western Australia, you've got lots of opportunity to say, okay, here's a grid it's only 4,000, 5,000 megawatts in the Swiss. It's got up to about 6,000 megs capacity, but I can play in there quite happily. And if I add some new kit in here and see how it works, pretty well.
It's a very measurable difference.
I can go to this slightly smaller grid just up the north, where there's a lot of industry involved, and think about dispatchable power and demand side management and do all that sort of thing. That's another location you can do it. Or you can go to one of the smaller towns. Broome's not a smaller town; it's 20 meg, but you can go to towns that have 1 or 2 meg, and then start to think, how does my kit fit into this microgrid, this macrogrid, this normal grid, whatever a normal grid is.
And just so I understand, those grids then are separate. They're kind of isolated in that sense. There's not a wire that goes from Perth all the way up to the north of...
No, because you're talking 1,600, 2,000 kilometres. For example, we've talked in Western Australia about pumping water from the Ord to Perth. Seems entirely practical. Technically, completely feasible. But the problem with water is it's heavy. And when you move water 100 kilometres, you need about 20 megs of energy.
Wow, to push it. Isn't that extraordinary? You don't think of it.
Especially in the situation where 95% of Australia is under 1,500 metres tall. And when you get to Western Australia, it's even more so. It's just a flat place. So you're not going to get any gravity advantage. You could pump it off of a hill down the slope, but not too many hills. So you actually think about how that all comes together. So the idea of actually pumping water somewhere from 1,600 kilometres to another and using 320 megawatts of energy to do it,
that's a lot.
Thinks, that's a lot of D-cell plants. And D-cell plants are actually terribly good. They're improving all the time, and they can be run on renewables. So the only reason to build a pipeline in that scenario would be, actually, I want an offshoot here and an offshoot there, and that's going to spark feed a community or spark a new industry. So therefore, it's worth 1,600 kilometres of pipeline. So I can go on about that, but that's another opportunity.
But then, I mean, what I'm interested in then is that those grid systems existed 25, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever. But has there been a kind of a more measurable or more noticeable impact of renewables on those grids, because they can adopt them? I don't know. I mean, has it? I'm just thinking, like, the national grid in the UK is like completely set up for coal plants on the coast or on rivers, and nuclear plants and gas plants, and now we're kind of going through the pain of adopting it, because there's some stuff offshore here and stuff there. And, it's a very established system that's very interconnected, whereas this, you've got quite isolated. I don't know whether
and
it's
adding
easy.
the complication of fairly rapid growth. I mean, Last century, Perth was only 1 million people. Now it's 2 million people.
Right,
You know,
okay.
so there's that
Yeah.
level of growth. We used to have Banksia woodlands. Now we don't have Banksia woodlands. There's houses on top of them.
Right.
You know, there's all these ancillary matters that cause biodiversity loss and so on, which also
Yeah.
need to be considered. But in terms of the energy equation, there has been substantial growth. In the early 2000s, the Western Power, the then authority for the whole of the grid, was encouraging people to take up air conditioners,
Right.
electric air conditioning as opposed to other form of cooling.
Right.
And so what that started to do was to load the grid up
Yeah.
to the point where we started to have air conditioner brownouts,
Right.
until the point that first really significant penetrations of solar started in about 2007, 2008.
Right.
By 2010, 2011, around about there, we had our last air conditioner brownout
Right.
because we'd added enough solar
To
that was
balance
making
it.
up. And of course, mostly you want your air conditioner when the sun's shining.
Yeah.
So that all works. And we're actually an interesting point where Western Australia is at the moment is that we've been importing coal. We have a coal mine that's been
Wait a minute.
dysfunctional.
You're importing coal into
Yes,
Western Australia.
because the grid manager is concerned that this summer in Western Australia, because of the heat that's likely to come associated with El Nino, all these things are connected, that we may see an over demand for air conditioning
Right.
load, because as people have been putting on more solar panels, have actually also thinking, yeah, this is great, we can also put on more air conditioning.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And so
it's
both of
constant
those road
race.
trips are going.
Yeah.
And you know, the middle of summer on a really good renewables day, there's only about 600 megs of load left for
Right.
everybody else, because
Right.
solar's making it all.
Yeah.
But on the rare occasions where it's humid and cloud cover and solar generation is down, the market operator, Australian Energy Market Operator, is concerned about the chance that we might actually have brownouts as a
Right.
consequence of demand.
Right.
So to meet that, they've been importing a bit of coal,
Wow.
controversially,
Yeah.
to Collie, which is a coal mine itself, but is dysfunctional because the owner of it has been bankrupt. It's a great story. I really don't know the full detail
Right.
of it, but they're the headlines.
But there is a coal mine. That's extraordinary. So
Yeah.
there, because I've sort of connect Western Australia. You know, you've definitely got coal, iron ore, coal.
Yep.
A lot of things. We'll talk about that later. But so you're actually importing it, but you like storing it at a coal mine. Is
Yeah,
it?
it's a security measure, so it's purely there just in case for this summer period. Now, at the same time, and rather in some senses belatedly, but in a timely fashion, that's a bit paradoxical, is that we're also now building batteries in the state.
Right.
So Synergy, the main government-owned retailer, is building a 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt hour battery in Perth.
Right.
It won't be ready till about April, May.
Right.
We've got to move that.
So you've got that. Oh, I see.
Yeah,
So you've
if
got-
we
you've got
if we
this
only had to
contact-
move that forward a little
Yeah.
bit, you know, we would have
Yeah.
been okay. But that's the outcome. At the same time, the solar development that I was involved in at Cunderdin, which was a 125 megawatt solar farm,
Right.
it's going to have a 55 megawatt, 220 megawatt hour battery, so
Right.
it'll be the biggest in the state when
Right.
it gets built. It's being built right now, and it'll be operational next year.
Right.
You know, that's a private development. It came on its own timelines.
Yeah.
But if we had a couple of those, there's no reason why
Right.
we would have been importing coal.
Right.
But they're not there yet, so
Yeah.
this year we'll need it. Next year we certainly won't.
Right. And that's really interesting then. So that transition, because I mean, I think that's always the doubt, which I completely understand when people doubt that it's possible to be 100% renewable or close.
Yeah.
And you always need the backup power. And, you know, that's a good example. You're having to import, but we're in this transition. That's why I've always argued, yeah, we can't do it now, today.
Yeah.
But next year or 2 years' time, we will be able to. And it's being able to, in a way, I feel I understand the energy system here a little bit easier because it's not so clogged with history and density and colossal.
Yeah.
You know, you imagine what London consumes. I don't even want to think, but it's just
Yeah, I could do the math, but
multiple
I
gigawatts.
might need an
You know,
envelope.
yeah. But so it's a kind of slightly easier to understand the energy system here.
Yeah. So I mean, comparing it to the East Coast and the national electricity market process, you know, we're seeing sort of 40% renewable energy penetration now on the NEM.
Right.
In Western Australia, we're seeing days where it's exceeding 80%.
Right.
And on average, on most days, it's around about 60% from sunrise through to the evening.
Yeah.
Western Australia, being flat, is a particularly windy place.
Right.
The winds blow through very effectively.
Right.
The wind farms...
Even inland, you could get... Right.
So the capacity factor for wind farms on land in Western Australia is around about 38%, some of them up to 42%.
Right.
Which is originally when they were being built, everybody was saying, they'll be about 33. So they're much more productive than we imagined. And wind blows generally more strongly at night time.
Right.
And so what we find in Western Australia is during the day, we've got the solar peak. It's pretty much mopping up around about 2 gigs of generation,
right?
Leaving only about 600 megs for the coal and the gas guys, mostly the gas guys, to mop up. But in overnight, we really need to increase our amount of wind by about threefold.
Right.
At night time, we're seeing about 30 to 40% of West Australia's generation needs being met by wind.
Right.
So the average is that's why the average is coming down to around about the 40% mark. It's similar to the NEM,
right?
Just slightly better than the NEM. We've got 40%, almost 40% of homes now with solar panels on rooftops.
40%, that's extraordinary.
Which makes up to about well over 2.5 gigs of generation capacity,
right?
Translating to around about 2 gigs at peak,
right?
With efficiencies and all the other bits and the uncounted bits.
Yeah.
That all means that during the middle of the day, there's this big hole in the market where solar is just self-generating. Most people are making their own energy and running their own air conditioners.
Yeah.
So the thing that we're going back to, that why coal, why gas is still needed for that point up until they're replaced by batteries.
Yeah.
I originally, as a futurist back in the late 2017, 2018, I was suggesting that by 2023 we wouldn't need gas-fired power.
Right.
I reckon I'm about a year wrong.
Right.
It's really going to be next year.
It's going to be 2024, right?
Yeah. And that's only because some of the projects that I thought would be more advanced than now would have been built in 2021 and 2022.
Yeah.
But COVID.
There's quite a lot of...
COVID, supply chain,
Yeah.
Pricing,
Yeah.
Australian dollar going through the floor.
Right.
All of those things have slowed up projects in Australia to a degree.
But I mean, that's interesting that they are still going ahead. So big grid batteries, that's not a cheap investment, even for a private company or for a government. It's fairly chunky.
The project I'm talking about, I'm not allowed to say exact numbers, but it's around about $250 million.
Right.
That's the Cunderton project. So it's a bit of chunk of change.
Yeah.
How much do we need to build? Well, 250 billion's worth, but it's still a reasonable chunk of change.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of getting that lined up so that the investor and the owner, can do this affordably and expect to run it for 20 years. And, the objective is not to go broke.
Yes, which is quite good. Yeah.
And sometimes we forget that is a core part of it. The West Australian market is really different to the East Coast market in the sense because we have this other mechanism called a capacity market mechanism.
Right.
And it essentially pays your power plant to be present.
Yeah, which I think we do in the UK as well.
And they're currently talking about it on East Coast of Australia to do the same thing.
Yeah.
But
so that means you get paid even if you don't generate any electricity, because you're ready to if you need to be.
If you're generating electricity at the appropriate moments when there's grid load, you're getting rewarded for being a generator present in that time. It's the peak period for Western Australia, which is fairly typical of markets, is between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m.
Right.
And that's,
that is the same peak period then. So the same as it is in the Northern Hemisphere.
It's when we all come home, we switch on the stove and cook dinner and switch on the telly to watch Peyton Place or whatever it is we watch these days.
That doesn't date either of us. That we know, we both know what Peyton Place is without any hesitation.
Sorry, my bad.
Married at First Sight Australia. That's what we'd watch now.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yes. I really don't warm to these. My children who are 26 and 30 that's different. But yeah. Okay. Let's just move on, shall we?
But then, the other big question that was really knocked us for six in the UK was the argument was, renewables are cheaper. I mean, it's obvious, and people accept that now. We all understand that. I think the general public, not just nerds who are interested in the energy market, understand that offshore wind, for example, is cheaper. Solar is cheaper than gas or coal or nuclear.
Yeah.
But what happened to us was the price went off the scale. I mean, it went up a ridiculous amount. It's coming back down again now. But for a while, the predictions were, I think it's three times more expensive, and yet we've got the most solar and the most wind that we've ever had, and it's how it affects the economics of that. Because, I know from having solar at my house, I save an enormous amount of money on electricity bills because I don't buy that much electricity over the whole year.
Yeah.
But is that affecting? How does that affect the economics of it? Affect like an individual family with a house which has got solar on it, and their power bills presumably have gone down.
Yeah, look, so certainly those that can have been able to, in the first instance, afford to have solar because it still was an expense you had to pay, and householders that have adopted it have made that saving. Payback time for a householder is less than 4 years.
Right.
If you convert that into an interest rate, that's 25% per annum on your money.
Right. Right.
The answer is, if you haven't done it, why not? Are you nuts?
Yeah.
Do you not like money?
Yes.
Now, some people that may be fair. Like, I don't like money. So that opportunity to save is there. But of course, where it falls over is tenants who may want solar can't get it. Some tenants who are less well waged, shall we say, certainly can't afford to do it. If you embed solar panels into your mortgage, it's a 25% return. Your mortgage is 4%, 3%, 5%, depending where you are.
Yeah.
Then obviously it makes a great deal of sense to whack your solar panels onto your mortgage and do it as a whole package, and you'll pay that back. And then eventually it reduces the cost of your mortgage, because once you've made your payback for your solar panels in an economic sense, any spare cash you've got from saving from your energy generation can be a subsidy for your mortgage, a personal subsidy for your mortgage, as long as you're disciplined.
And are there people, mortgage brokers, that will include solar into it? I mean, is that a thing?
I anticipated we would have been flooded with them, but it's not. It's
not a big thing.
It's not a big thing. It's not as big as I imagined it might be. But that's for householders and people with a mortgage, and there's that chunk. There's the other group with tenants where they have landlords. Landlords don't necessarily get rewarded for putting solar on because they don't pay the electricity bills.
Right.
And they don't pay the electricity bills, so why would I put solar on?
Yeah.
So, we've got to overcome that. And there's a whole range of building standards that come back for the built environment, which are relevant here. And Australia has its national building code, and it's currently universally been. We've reached what we call a 6-star energy rating.
Right.
We're about to go to 7. That legislation, with the new federal government coordinating with all the state governments, that legislation will go through nationally this year, and it'll take them 18 months to trot out the legislation. Too slow, but that's what they'll do. Yeah. But that will start to say that when you renovate a building or you build a new building, it has to have solar.
Right.
6-star just said, you could have solar, or you could have passive cooling, or you could, just stroke your hair in the right way. But if you have them. But the 7-star is going to mandate the inclusion of this.
That's really good.
And so, again, those same sorts of policies are relevant globally. It just makes sense. How do you deal with the tenancy? That's got to be considered in this new range. And then how do you deal with the leftovers? Now, one of the interesting things about talking about people who do or don't like money, the phenomenon still exists that the richest suburbs have the least solar.
Wow, that is very interesting, isn't it? Wow.
It still remains true today. Wow. They're catching up, and it's everybody's creeping upwards. So the saving presumably is so insignificant that they're not doing it.
Yeah, I suppose if you've got a private jet, then saving $40 on your electricity bill is not terribly important.
Yeah, look, the private jet thing is an interesting one. Are they going to buy biofuels and do offsets? I'm not sure. Yeah. Taylor Swift keeps, we'll mention Taylor Swift. We'll get another 100,000 hits. She's got her aircraft. From what I understand, those sorts of aircraft, I'm not making excuses, but generally it's not just her jumping on; it's her and a crew and
we hope
another
a few
100
other people.
Well, yeah,
but
it's not just
still,
two other people,
it's
but
still pretty.
it is,
Yeah.
yeah. But you know that, say, airlines like Qantas in Australia have a biofuels program.
Right.
They have biofuels flying to London and back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're actually doing stuff that's going to work there. We need around about 160 million tonnes of biofuels.
Right.
We're capable of making about 30 million tonnes.
Right.
So it's about a factor of 5 that we need to increase
Right.
biofuels production. So I think I've got my numbers right. Somebody will correct it on the
Yes,
on the feedback, so that's okay. So, but I think that we still haven't yet started to address. It's not going to be corn syrup. It needs to be non-food based.
Yes.
It's got to be meeting these sustainability principles. We've got farmers in Australia who are already producing biofuels in contracts for Qantas.
Right.
And that's reflected globally in other airlines that are doing similar sorts of things. The global airline industry, like everybody, is saying, by 2050 or 2060, we're going to be carbon neutral. That's okay. And by 2050 or 2060, everybody that promised that will be retired or dead.
Yeah.
That's okay. They can do it.
Yes.
So we've got to actually contain that sort of ambition for where biofuels goes. We started talking about solar panels. I've taken us down a rabbit hole.
No, that's good. But they're all quality rabbit holes. But the one interesting one then, I was trying to get back to the cost. Whether you see in 5 years' time, let's go ahead 5 years, that the majority of power, let's just stick with Western Australia, the majority of power generated is from renewables. Do you see a sort of an actual decrease in electricity bills over that time, or is that not really?
It should, in essence, happen. So the dilemma we've faced to date is that to compensate for the intermittency of solar and wind, and yes, it doesn't blow,
Yes.
But
I love the fact when people comment on that, like we haven't thought about that.
Oh gosh,
I never thought of that.
if only I had realised that before I invented a solar panel factory. But we've got to get the bridging. The bridging is the batteries.
Yes.
Once the batteries come in, we will actually achieve all of that. And after that point, we can then expect pricing to come down.
Yeah.
Because over time, we'll add more batteries, but over time, when we add those batteries, they'll get cheaper and cheaper because volume and scale, Wright's law, all those wonderful things that drive product pricing down as you increase production.
And solar panels are a brilliant example of that, aren't they? The cost, I love that original cost of solar panels that NASA used on spacecraft were like $100,000 for 2 square inches, just insanely.
Something smaller than my head. Yes.
And how much cheaper they've got, even in the time I've had them, which is, I guess, 15 years, when I replaced my first lot, I couldn't believe how much cheaper. It was less than half the price to produce more electricity.
I'm in exactly the same position now. When I was running the Sustainable Energy Association in WA, I was advocating at that point for a feed-in tariff.
Right.
And because I was doing that, I nobly, some people said sillily, but I say nobly, chose not to put solar panels on because I didn't want to be arguing for something that I would benefit from.
Right, okay.
And so therefore I was saying, you've got to have a feed-in tariff, got to the end of that process, feed-in tariff ended, I put solar panels on.
Right.
I'm just this noble guy.
Yeah.
But
I did exactly the same. I just thought it's not.
That was in 2012. So mine are now 10 years old, and I only put 2 kilowatts on at the time. I've added air conditioning since then.
Right.
So my power bills have spiked back up, and I'm just about to actually completely redo the whole house. I'm going to put, instead of 2 kilowatts, I'll have 6 kilowatts. Instead of the old dumb inverter, I'm going to have a smart inverter, and I'm going to have a battery pack in the corner, and that's all going to happen this year. And from an Australian perspective, this year's going to be king. This year really will be the time when batteries become affordable. And it's a decade-long process, of course. They'll be more affordable for others in 2 years and 5 years, of course they will. But right now, a larger chunk of the population will be able to afford it and do it. Where we've got 40% of homes with rooftop solar, over the space of 2007 to, well, let's start the clock at 2010 because that's easier math, to now 12 years, we should expect to get to the same proportion of houses, in my view, through my analytics, within 8 years. So in 8 years' time, 40% of homes will have batteries. You put 6 kilowatts of solar on,
Yeah.
You usually match that by doubling it to say, I need at least 12 kilowatts of batteries.
12 kilowatt hours. Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
for that 6 kilowatts right now is translating into 18 gigs of solar on rooftops.
Wow.
So we should be expecting within 8 years 36 gigawatt hours of battery storage owned by people.
Wow.
Now, I think you've seen David Osmond's work, where he's working in Australia and he's modelling the national electricity market.
Yeah.
And what he's done is he's factored in how much wind we need to be 100% wind and 100% solar. And what his model suggests is that we need 28 gigawatt hours of storage to run Australia.
Wow. So less than
we will install naturally.
Right.
So, going back to the original question, when all of that is in place, paid for by private money, then the cost of power should be really minimal.
Yeah.
The challenge is, in that scenario, I often say this, is what do you do with free? What do economists do with free?
Yes.
What does the Reserve Bank do with free?
Yeah.
Will the Reserve Bank bring interest rates negative because everything's free?
Yeah. Yes.
Energy price being a major component of the CPI basket.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if we eliminate that cost, and this is what the Electrify Everything cause is doing with Saul and all the stuff he's talking about, and what the Inflation Reduction Act in America is trying to achieve is saying that electricity is anti-inflationary, because if we keep feeding it with renewables and the price is contained, then it can never contribute to inflation.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Which kind of makes a logical sense.
Makes a lot of sense for households. It makes even more sense for transport, because then you won't be paying $2 a litre for diesel.
Yeah.
Because you'll be running on electricity, which happens to be 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And by the way, if you want, you can generate it yourself.
You can make your own. Yeah.
And with 6 kilowatts on your roof, that'll be substantial. A lot of talk in around that same market. This is, again, global. Leads naturally into where we were, is that a lot of people talking about vehicle to grid.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking about this back in
2017. A long time ago.
Yes. And I remain a skeptic about vehicle to grid.
Right.
There's some people saying, oh, look, I spent $90,000 on my motor car to get 77 kilowatts of batteries, so therefore I want to use it as much as I can, so I use it on my house. I'm arguing that batteries will just get so cheap that the most logical thing to do with a battery is to have a stationary battery at home, and you come home and you recharge your car. Because if you come home at night and you don't have your solar working, it's actually charged up through the day, and then you just dump a load into your car. So I think in emergency scenarios, in sort of extreme events where you've had outages on the network, and
you could use car then.
Then sure, go for your car. I'd like to add to that, and it's an idea that we're working on at Future Smart, is the idea of electrified trailers, and not just trailers that you tow to add range extender to your car, but trailers that are actually electric. So a trailer can have batteries in it. It can actually have electric motors on the wheels. It can be an unweighted tow vehicle. So it's now a smart vehicle that follows you, as opposed to being a dumb vehicle that's pulled along. If you can do that, then when you tow a trailer, it shouldn't take any range off your motor car. If that's a caravan, it shouldn't take any range off your motor car. If it was a prime mover and it was doggies behind the prime mover, then your prime mover needs less batteries. It doesn't need to pull that weight.
When you say that, because I'll just make sure I understand, that like a big truck that carries a load, but then what I would call a big trailer behind it. So if that big trailer is powered as well separately.
Yep, it carries its own batteries. It's got electric motors on its wheels. Every time you brake on the prime mover, you've still got to stop the weight of the trailer. And some of that can go to recharging. But actually, if your trailer wheels are also recharging, and it can go back to its own batteries. Think about the caravanners. Then less than sort of 8% of traffic is recreational vehicle traffic. But if you've got a caravan at home, while you're at home, it helps power your home. So you might have a caravan to home
I see.
battery, but then you go on holiday, you take your caravan with you, and you take your batteries with you. And it's all sort of works together.
Because I think the other thing which we haven't really seen yet, because it's too soon, is the period of time when we get to 15-year-old electric vehicles that still work. I think this is the other thing, is that you're going, why, when the batteries wear out, you've got to throw them away after 3 years. You go, well, actually, even if the battery loses a lot of capacity, early Nissan Leaf's a good example.
Yeah.
They still worked.
Yeah,
you can still drive it.
You've got an electric car that lasted 3 years. Oh, wow.
Yes. And now you're talking cars that are lasting 10, 15, maybe even more. But once those batteries have reached the end of their useful life in a car, I mean, I've seen this on a sort of artisanal level where they repackage those things. But that makes so much sense. I mean, a big company could say, look, I'm going to take these 400,000 electric car batteries and make a million home storage units out of them.
Yeah, look, I think...
they've got another 10 years probably minimum of useful life in that role.
One of the things that, and this is absolutely critical because we're talking about, generally talking about sustainability.
Yeah.
One of the things that's critical is, what's the second use?
Yeah.
But actually, I think that the second use is more likely to be going back to the factory to be refurbished.
Right.
Some of them will be recycled, depending on it, because the batteries we're making now have different sets of minerals in them, resources and metals in them. At larger components, in 10 years' time when we retire them, we might go, oh, well, we're better off recycling that battery, taking out all of that stuff, putting it into the new form.
To the new form, right.
And that'll be cheaper because we actually we salvage that material, we didn't have to mine it.
Yeah.
And so I think that the recycling ecosystem really has to be switched on to do that. To do that, we need governments who are absolutely saying, we need Tanya Plibersek out there demanding that there is recycling mandated and that you can't send stuff to landfill.
Yeah.
And in the interim, unfortunately, Tanya's going to have to open up Jim Chalmers' pocket and get the Treasurer to pay for some of this early activity.
Right.
But we've got to create that ecosystem so that recycling can occur. And, by the way, actually some of them we might keep for reuse instead of recycling.
Yeah.
That could well make as much sense. But I see a point at some point where it'll flip over and say, actually, no, it's easier for us to recover the materials, reuse them, put them into something even better, and then bring it back to market.
Yeah.
That's still at least a decade away because we have to get to the point where we've got recycling volume.
Yes.
The amount of batteries that are coming to be recycled right now are really just made up of the AA and the AAAs.
Yeah, and old phones and laptops and things. Yeah.
It's just, it's this scale of volume. And it'll be 10 years before we see any real scale. So last year, 2022, Australia bought 33,000 electric vehicles.
Right.
Which is a whole pile of not much.
Yeah.
And they'll be recycled, let's say they're recycled in 15 years' time, or at least their batteries are.
Yeah.
Now, probably the whole car, I think that what we've been seeing globally and in Australia and in the UK, US, the same trends, is that the age of the fleet over the last 3 years has got older.
Right.
There's a whole range of explanations.
So people are holding on to cars longer. Yeah.
So partly that's down to, I can't get the new one, so therefore I've still got the old one.
Yeah.
So that adds to the age. Partly it's to do with, actually, I'm not going to sell my car yet because there's an electric one coming and everybody said it'd be here in 2021 and it's 2023 and I still haven't sold it.
Right.
So again, your age of your fleet has just got older.
Yeah.
But at some point we're going to go past the cusp and we'll get into the shallow part of the pool and we go, oh, there's electric cars available. Everybody replaces their car. And so suddenly I expect that the age of global and regional car fleets will suddenly fall very quickly. And that's going to be marvellous because not only will they be moving to non-polluting electric vehicles, but non-polluting electric vehicles that are radically more safe.
Yeah.
And with the exception of the very large trucks that the American citizens insist on buying and driving around to pick up the kids, those cars will be much, much safer. We've seen some really unfortunate incidents recently of large vehicles, trucks. The things that kill us on roads are the larger vehicles.
Yeah.
SUVs are the larger vehicles, so SUVs kill us more commonly than passenger cars.
Right, wow.
It's statistically. So if there's more SUVs on the road, there will be more deaths.
Right, wow.
And the same is true for the larger trucks. A lot of the deaths are associated with people turning a corner.
Yeah.
They didn't quite look, they didn't quite see.
Yeah.
The new driver assist technology, which is evolving into the autonomous technology, but right now we're in driver assist mode, that's actually capable of saving lives right now.
Right.
But when you buy the car, you can buy it and then switch it off.
Right.
When you buy the car, it might not necessarily come with it. Actually, almost every car these days comes with
pretty
an option.
much. Yeah.
And so, again, autonomy has been something else I've been tracking in terms of
Right.
how its impact will impact the global fleet, the distance we travel, the sort of vehicle miles that we do. And so what we'll see is that this driver assist initially will help reduce the road toll in a way that we've never done before. It'll be better than seat belts because
Right.
seat belts have, we over 50 years, we've
The
dramatically
cars have got so
improved.
much safer. Yeah.
But at the same time, we've improved the weight, and so the cars that kill us
Yeah. Just.
are also coming thick and fast.
Whereas you might got knocked down and broken a leg, you are now definitely dead because that thing is so big and heavy, and they wouldn't have seen you because it's so big and heavy.
I saw a wonderful graphic today which said that we're going to mandate that all children wear stilts so that we can
So that we can see
so they're
them over
visible on the road.
over the bonnet of your 3-ton as you driving to get a litre of milk. Yeah.
So, that, again, that's perhaps a much longer topic for a much different day. But
there is. I mean, I would love to talk to you because I think there is one of the discussions around autonomous vehicles, and I've been in a few, and they've been very impressive. But it's the ownership model. Really, it's about our relationship with cars, and that's. I never questioned that when I drove combustion cars. I'd never even thought about it. It wasn't even a topic. You buy a car, you drive a car, you sell a car. That's it. That's the full range of your relationship. And when you see autonomous cars, you go, well, I don't know if I want to be in an autonomous car, but all I know is I don't want to own an autonomous car. I want to have a ride in one. I want it to take me somewhere, but I don't necessarily want it to be my car. I think that's the difference. And the one or two occasions I've seen examples of cars that will come to where you are. And the doors open, you get in and you drive it. This is purely from an insurance point of view. The insurance companies like that because they can understand it. When there's no one in it, that's entirely the manufacturer or the operator's responsibility. And when you're in it, you're insured by them. You've given them money and you're covered by them. And you drive the car and then you get out and it drives off. And that appeals because that means I don't have to worry about parking or maintenance or servicing or refueling or anything. I just use the car to get me to where I'm going, then I get out of it,
Yeah, one certainty in life, the three certainties, death, taxes, and lawyers will get rich. But I think that ownership model will change. And it also changes our demand for performance.
Right.
Because the person that wants to go fast is the person driving the car.
Yes, no one else does.
So you take the driver out of it and you go, I don't care if I beat the other car off the lights, because, that's
nothing to do with me.
That's it. So I'm just a passenger. And sometimes the passenger looks across at the driver and say, "Why are you going so damn fast?" Sometimes they don't. They're teens. There are teens in the cars. But I think that ownership model will change. It's the autonomy side of things is not coming quite as fast as Musk was suggesting last decade. It's not coming quite as fast as we imagined. Some of that hold up is because we've really been it's not a short supply of computer chips. It's just a huge demand for chips. Everybody says that they're in short supply, but that's because it's being demand led. And one of the things that happened with the computer chip shortage, when COVID hit in 2020, a lot of the existing legacy manufacturers or the OEMs for motor cars said to their chip suppliers, cancel the chip order.
All right, we don't want
it. We're
not making anything. Wow.
And then 3 months later, they'd realised, that was a mistake. Meanwhile, the electric car guys who are all going gangbusters and all seeing their volumes climb, saying, this isn't going to stop. So let's just double our order. So what we're discovering is that electric cars generally aren't being shortchanged or in short supply because of supply constraints. There's a lot of grey in there because obviously there's lithium and there's all the materials that you need to build a car. But it comes back to they're not being short supply there. Because people have been charging a premium for electric cars, they're also expecting those electric cars to come with all the fruit. If you're going to have all the fruit, you've got to have the driver assist, and you've got to have and that's all computing power. So you've got to have the computer chips. So there's a degree of that happening as well. And the aside is Toyota using their argument, let's build a lot more hybrids because that's a lot more batteries, and that'll go further. And we both know that's wrong, but that's what they're arguing. So what does that mean about autonomy? What does that mean about car ownership? It means that it's going to come. It hasn't come quite as fast as I imagined it would, again, because of the delays of the last couple of years. But it'll fall out the other side, and when it does, cars will be used more often, but the cars will be fewer because they'll be being shared, as well as those that continue to own them privately, but even in their case, they're likely to use their car more often.
Right.
They're less likely to have a spare car, because if they have a car at home, they can go to work, they can send it home,
it
can park at home. Some of that does lead to more traffic, which is what the built environment people and the Brett Toderin and others are commonly making the case for. There is an issue where we transition, but I think ultimately there will be half as many cars on the road because of private ownership, and also the journey miles of those cars will be double.
Right, so they'll go further. The fewer cars will be driven. Because I mean, that's one of the stark statistics. Again, I never even asked anyone, was the percentage of time that you're actually using a car if you own one. If you buy a car, it's so shocking. Because every time I say it, I can't believe that's right. But it's about between 5 and 8% of the time you own it, you're using it.
So I mean,
the most.
And actually that applies to a lot of vehicles. So we're sitting here opposite the river. There's a couple of boats moored behind us. The stats out of Western Australia, which I believe are fairly universal, is that 80% of boats never leave their mooring.
Never leave
their mooring.
Wow,
there's an exception to the first year of ownership.
Right.
But after the first year ownership, 80% don't leave their mooring. So with cars, we're closer to. We're not quite that bad, but it's there's certainly be cars sitting in garages that don't leave the garage more than once a month.
No, absolutely, without question.
But
it just seems a kind of, when you look at it like that, a really wasteful use of resources, in the sense that if you're a multi-billionaire and you've got 10 houses, you're probably using each one of those houses like 5% of the year. But then that's ridiculous, and obscene and disgusting, and most people would be appalled at it. But your car is perfectly normal to only use it 5% of the time. Well, that's why in a sense I can see that, and I think it's going to be generational. I think our generation grew up with car ownership as a kind of achievement goal, wasn't it? When we were young, it was a thing.
So I mean, it's an interesting thing. We know with the demographics, we know that millennials are doing things very differently. We know that Gen Z is doing things very differently. We commonly referred to them early on as the me generation. It's all about me. It's all about the social media and taking pictures and so forth. But what we've got to is that they're driving less, they're using public transport more. They're eating differently. They're worried about local food. There's a whole gamut of sustainability stuff that they're actually quite enamored with. And so my daughter fits that profile.
My children do too.
And so the change that brings is demographic one. It's an economic one, because they're now adults, and they now have their spending power determining whether I buy an Apple product or a Samsung product, depending on whether it's more sustainable. As long as they both do the same thing, I'm going to choose the more sustainable one. It's also going through to, as I said, the local foods, as a wave of vegetarianism growing. Europe is now up to about 17% vegetarianism. Started at around about 10% earlier in the century. So it's been growing steadily, slowly. It hasn't been a breakaway Rogers S-curve kind of thing. But what we're waiting for is the technology that makes it actually more accessible. And that's a thing called I'm going to get the wrong phrase. I'm going to call it precision bioreactors.
Yes, but I know what you mean. Yes, precision fermentation.
That's the one. That's the one.
That's very unusual for me to remember anything, but I've been reading a lot about that.
And what that represents is not only just making plant protein in intense agricultural situations or bioreactor situations, but actually to the point where we're making meat from. Now, it's real meat. It'll look like a Scotch fillet. It'll look like an eye fillet, whatever you want. But it'll come out of a bioreactor, and no animal will be harmed in the filming of this product. So what they're doing there is they're actually culturing cells, and what they have to get to is the point of where they can actually essentially 3D print, if you will, the steak.
Yeah, or whatever,
and then
chicken or whatever.
chicken or whatever, and it comes out and it'll look like it, it'll cut through it.
Yeah.
It won't be a chicken with bones, it'll be a chicken
Yeah.
like a breast fillet or whatever. I guess the challenge there is that.
But it's also what that's made of. So if that's fulfilling the same role in terms of what you eat,
it's actually made of animal.
right?
It's animal cell cultured.
Right. Yeah.
It's not animal cell slaughtered.
Yeah.
And so, the world let me slow down a bit. All of the meat protein that we eat in the world comes from 7 animals.
Right. Yes.
For the most part.
Yeah.
And it's all the other ones. Chicken is the most common. We eat 60 billion chickens a year.
It's just insane.
And then after that is beef, pork, mutton,
Yeah.
goat, and there's one I'm missing. One I'm missing there. The list is quite extraordinary.
Because I think you posted a tweet a while ago about how many animals are consumed by humans and their pets.
And their pets. 60% of animals. So 60% of animal biomass annually is consumed by humans and their pets.
And their pets. Yeah.
30% is of that biomass is then animals in the field, and 4% is wildlife.
That's incredible. 4%.
We've changed it. We've changed the planet that much.
So I wonder, even in our lifetimes, I would imagine that has shifted.
Yeah, so
number,
so really the mid-70s is when we really started to accelerate there. Obviously reflecting the human population, hitting 8 billion. That's got to be a factor. The real big change, which started as a Gen Z conversation, is that demographic shift, that willingness to try.
Yeah.
So the other statistic is that in the population over 60%, only about 20% of people have tried non-meat protein.
Right.
Under the age of 40, that's 45%.
Right.
Under the age of 30, it's at least half.
Yeah.
So those sorts of numbers are out there, and that means that this voting population that'll eventually have political power are going to drive this process forward. Yeah. We will get the change, you need generational change. We're getting it over time.
Yeah.
We have to have time as a resource to get it.
Yes. And I mean, also that influence. I mean, I was not a vegetarian. I tried to be a vegetarian when I was a hippie. I gave up back in the 70s. And then I wasn't one. And
I assume you had longer hair.
I had an enormous amount of hair. I was very proud of it. I look at pictures of it now.
Yes.
Got 1 or 2 black and white pictures when I actually had hair. But my daughter's influence on all of us, in a way, she just never ate meat.
Yeah.
You know, she didn't want it. As a little toddler, we'd give her the same food we had.
Yeah.
And she just left the meat. She'd eat everything else. And so I eventually, because of cooking at home, I stopped eating meat, and not overnight, but I haven't eaten any meat for a long time. And it was also a moment where I went to a car launch where there was a free buffet.
Yeah.
There was loads of ham. And normally I would go, and I suddenly got there and went, I don't want it. It's such a weird change.
Yes.
So it wasn't like, I'm going to do it. It was like, I don't want it anymore. I don't need it. And also living in a farming area, understanding the impacts of it. And in particular, I think driving past a cattle processing plant in California on a scale where it took like half an hour to drive past it, and the smell was unimaginable, and it was like 100 million cattle a month go through it and make the burgers. I don't want to be part of that, whatever that is.
Yes.
It's not sustainable. It's wrong. It's just you don't have to be sentimental about animals at all. You just go, that's just a stupid economic system. It doesn't work.
If you actually put economists in charge of the efficiency of the food chain, and removed all other assumptions,
right,
they'd make a calculation and say, this is crazy.
Yes. Well, the amount of land we use to grow the food, to feed the animals,
But because biodiversity is not valued in that equation, because the land use is not, and take on the layers, all of those things aren't valued in that equation. All we do is get a dollar equation at the end, and so therefore, it makes a profit rate.
Yes. Yeah.
And obviously in Australia, we've just had the Treasurer Jim Chalmers talk about ethic-based, or value-based, I should say, value-based economics,
right,
and caused a hell of a stir in the Australian. The crazy hippies are in charge again. But if your economy is not value based, what's the point of your economy?
Well, and it is also I think it's becoming very apparent now that, and again in our lifetime, I think when we were born, the difference between the poorest person in our world, so in Australasia, North America, Europe, the difference between the poorest and the richest was, measurable, and it was this much. And now it is unmeasurable. The richest are so rich. They're
unmeasurable because they're constantly in an aeroplane.
Yeah, they're in an airplane or in a spaceship, and they're so rich that there's no relation, and they've got all the money, and we've been left with nothing. And that, whatever your political opinion is, that is not sustainable, because that really upsets people.
Yeah.
And I think we're right to be, I see sort of comments and snideness about billionaires, even if they're essentially trying to do something positive. I go, they shouldn't be billionaires.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you don't need that bloody money. It's stupid. It just doesn't work. As a system, it doesn't work. As an economic system, it's unsustainable, I think.
That's the best bottom line. And I guess ultimately, it's been a continuous push to say the best person to spend $1 is the individual.
Right, yeah.
And this has been an absolute, capitalist or capitalist stereotype, is that give you all your taxes back, we're the ones that are best to make the decision. Now, I've got some sympathy for the argument. We all would have. However, the reason you have governments is to make wise decisions and to make the place better, not make the place worse.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're failing. And when we see globally so many companies not paying
any
centre
tax at all,
and who does that hurt the most? Actually, it hurts the average person. It doesn't hurt the billionaire.
No. I think we're going to go off on. I'm just going to see.
We're getting close to the mark.
We could go off on hundreds of very, very fascinating rabbit holes.
Yeah.
But I think I would better wind up there, Ray. But it's been a real joy talking to you, and you've got to come. We've got to do this again. We might have to do it remotely, and it's a real joy to actually be in the same room as you. And
I'm really looking forward to being at Fully Charged Down Under.
Fully Charged Live Down Under. Yeah, no, it is amazing, and it is so exciting. Well, what I'm so thrilled about is it's not sold out in terms of the public coming, but in terms of exhibitors and stands, it's full.
Yeah.
And that is brilliant, because I just thought, there's going to, that's not going to happen. And particularly car companies, there's going to be some cars on display at Fully Charged Live that have not been seen outside of China, basically. That's because there's a couple of companies I'm not allowed to say.
Well, I might be allowed to say one for you, because I saw it on Twitter yesterday. The MG4 is going to be there. The MG4
is going to be there.
So that one's out there in the public. It's a wild animal.
Yeah.
And I guess I've run these big events before when I was with the Sustainable Energy Association, and originally we actually bid for. I went to Aberdeen. To go to the All Energy Conference in Aberdeen with the intention of creating a All Energy Down Under.
Right.
And I was a year late because I just turned up as the Melbourne guys.
Right.
We're doing it.
Right.
Now, Melbourne is a better place than Perth for that particular event, I must say. But that's where it's changed, is that we've now got, and that was in 2007, 2008.
Right.
We've got to a point now where these are the lead industries. These are the pivotal industries of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And if you're not coming, then you're embracing the past. You're not embracing the future.
Really hope you enjoyed that episode. What a privilege it was speaking to Ray. What an absolute joy. I'd like to thank his brother for letting us use his front room in Brisbane. His brother was at work. We weren't interrupting him or anything. We snuck in and recorded a podcast when no one was looking. Really good fun. I got down to where Ray is staying, on a ferry on the Brisbane River. So you can't really beat it. It was very nice. Didn't have to go in a road vehicle at all. Please do tell your friends about the Fully Charged podcast, because I think you'll agree it is pretty exceptional, the people we get on here, and there's a lot more lined up, really amazing people. That's really subscribe, tell your mates, do spread the word about what we're doing. If you're in the UK, remember we've got the 2 shows, the one in Farnborough, which is swiftly followed by the one in Harrogate in Yorkshire. And for the dates and all the information about that, it's best to go to fullycharged.show and not listen to me tell you the wrong days, because I can't remember what they are now, because it's too hot. I'm not going to lie to you. It's a scorcher today. Anyway, that's all That's all from sunny Brisbane here in Australia. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.